What is the word? Do you know what the word is, Alyssa?
I think we have a couple of words today.
Yeah, we have a few words to get through today, at least, and they may even form sentences. Yeah, well, the word is an interesting concept because, we find the emphasis of the word, quote unquote, in spiritual things the world over. Specifically in the Bible, you have in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Mm-hmm. And then you have other traditions from the Quran to Hinduism and others that focus on something similar. The words of God, the mouth of God, logos. What do you relate it to? Anything?
No, I remember, some pop culture things always asking.
What's the word?
What's the word? But
word.
But when I think of religious traditions, growing up in the Southern Baptist tradition of Christianity, the word was always the Bible, and it wasn't even until I started exploring Swedenborg that the word became synonymous with God in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that God and the word may mean the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good place to delve in. Greetings, folks, and welcome to our new series, What is the Word? I have to have a big thank you to my compatriot in this, Alyssa Cover, for joining me, and also for being my fiancé. Thank you for many things, Alyssa.
Well, thank you. It's exciting to begin a new adventure and a new series with you, and to really get to delve into Swedenborg and religiosity and theology.
The Bible and whatever books we happen to grab.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we're interested in your word as well. So if you have any thoughts, ideas, or even suggestions for texts that mean a lot to you, please reach out to us at Swedenborgiancommunity.org. We are here to uplift you wherever you're at. We are your affirming interfaith Swedenborgian community. So thanks for joining us. And I also want to say a heartfelt thank you for those of you in the chatzy willing to literally share your words directly to us and to each other. Please feel free to comment as we go along. We plan to touch base from time to time. So what should we begin with? Our reading, perhaps?
Yeah, let's start with some reading.
And this is from the 18th century mystical thinker and visionary Emanuel Swedenborg's book, A New Jerusalem. You probably know Emanuel Swedenborg the most directly, if you're not into Swedenborg already, for things like the idea around how the solar system formed, and neuronal theory, how our brain works, and crazy things like that. But he also wrote about spirit. Mm-hmm. Would you like to do our reading today, Alyssa?
Yeah, so we're going to start our reading from the chapter titled Goodness and Truth, starting at section 11. All things in the universe that are in accord with the divine design go back to goodness and truth. There is no exception to this in heaven or in the world, because everything good, like everything true, comes from the divine, which is the source of everything. We see, then, that nothing is more necessary for us than knowing what is goodness and what is truth, and how each focuses on the other, as well as how each becomes joined to the other. It is particularly
I might have a chance. Particularly I almost messed it up.
Necessary, though, for people of the church, because as everything in heaven goes back to what is good and what is true, so does everything in the church. This is because the goodness and the truth that are in heaven are also the goodness and truth that are in the church. This is why I am starting off with the chapter of goodness and truth, on goodness and truth.
Wonderful. Wonderfully done. Thank you.
Yeah. One thing I love about Swedenborg, is that from the get-go, he always says exactly what he's going to tell you he's going to say. So you have no question about it. You know that this chapter is going to talk about what is goodness and truth and why it's important.
Yeah. I think all those scientific tomes he wrote before getting into spiritual things helped him like suss out structures he liked, which are, I do find him more digestible than often people will say about Swedenborg.
Oh, yeah.
So, shall we paraphrase what we just read?
Yeah.
Let's look at that first sentence. It says something about how everything is aligned with God's providence and thought, and it all connects back to how shall we relate goodness and truth, like kindness in heart and act, and reality.
Yeah,
like God's reality.
I mean, we can read more about that in a second, because Swedenborg does go on to ways in which we see goodness and truth, and that helps us define the words.
Nice.
But from just this, I see goodness and truth as like the pillars that hold up the universe in a way. And this doesn't tell us a lot about why they're important yet, but it's exciting to see what's going to happen from that.
Yeah. Well, shall we continue our paraphrase?
Sure.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay. There are no aspects of anything that don't relate to goodness and truth. Even evil, apparently, which is the source of everything, which comes from the God. We can then see that it's important to know about those ideas and how they relate to each other and focus on each other. And also for people who relate to spirituality and goodness in their own way, which is the church, according to Swedenborg, although often we use that word much more narrowly, should know about that, because everything related to those people's lives that love goodness and love relate back to this, just like everything in the wonderful realms of the afterlife. What are other words for heaven? Do you have any?
No, I really don't.
There's other words in other traditions, right? Like Elysium, the Elysium fields, and like, is that? I don't want to get it wrong. Greek, Roman type of things. Of course, there's many words for heaven. And then, how does he end? So he's starting off focusing on that idea. Yeah. Awesome. So what stands out to you in our reading today? That part of the reading.
I think it's interesting in these two sections that Swedenborg thinks it's important to point out that the church should really know about these things. Like, he doesn't just say these are important things for everyone to know. He says the church really, really should listen and figure it out because it's important to being, a person of religion.
Yeah, that stands out to me too. That it's not just about trying to be good or loving goodness or love. You have to kind of know what is good, And I think we learn that as we go along. Like, often our hearts, we might feel like we're a good person, but we find that we've been doing things that have been hurtful, and so we learn better. And so Swedenborg's saying, well, that is really important, because otherwise how do you know how to live? Yeah. And he often says, you should approach everything through your own rationality and what speaks to your own heart. So he's not going to force certain ideas down our throats, or at least he says we shouldn't allow him to. But it is good to explore these things, and things like Scripture, which many people call the Word, the Bible, the Quran, inform those things. And I know Emanuel Swedenborg especially loves pointing to the Hebrew and Christian Bible, or Bibles. Yeah, great. Anything else stand out to you in our section today?
No, I think moving on will be great, because then we get to see more about what goodness and truth means to Swedenborg and how we can relate it to our understandings of divinity and heaven and all those things.
Yeah, let's move on and give us a moment to breathe before you share this lovely next sentence as I play just a little bit, because I noticed someone in the chat said it's nice to take a few deep breaths between sentences of Swedenborg.
The divine design calls for goodness and truth to be joined together and not separated, to be one, then, and not two. They are together as they emanate from the Lord, and they are together in heaven, so they need to be joined to each other in the church. In heaven, the joining of what is good and what is true is called the heavenly marriage, because everyone there participates in this marriage. That is why heaven is compared to a marriage in the Word, and why the Lord is called the bridegroom and the husband, while heaven is called the bride and the wife, as is the church. The reason heaven and the church are so called is that the people there are respective to the divine goodness that is present within truths.
Yes, receptive, I believe.
Receptive.
It's not a word you see that often outside of Swedenborg, honestly. Okay, so what stood out to you with that? I would try to listen while I played this keyboard. I'm gonna work at it.
So we're starting to get to a point where Swedenborg is talking about goodness and truth and how they are interconnected, and using parallels between what goodness and truth is to the heavenly realm in his understanding, that being comparing the heavenly marriage of goodness and truth to God and heaven, or God and the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it struck me that he says they're not separated, that they're one, not two, and that this is called the heavenly marriage, and that can relate to such things as you mentioned, which is interesting because it means, to the extent that we are the church, according to Swedenborg's definition of that, which is around goodness and love and connectedness to divinity, God is one with us because we receive all those good things from God. They are God, in a sense, in our own kind of finite way. Huh. Anything else to reflect upon in this area of the reading? I'm curious. We are planning to get married in a year or so. How would you relate this to people in community, or people joined together in friendship or marriage? Mm-hmm. Does this inform anything about community for you? For me, I say, and I'm not sure if I have a full thought here, but it's interesting because there's this whole concept in Swedenborgian spirituality, which is a type of interfaith Christianity, as well as many other spiritualities, that you should look at your neighbor as yourself. And of course, Swedenborg focuses on that in his theology because it's in the Bible. And this idea that we should look at others, especially the good in other people, the neighbor, as extensions of ourselves, and not only that, as God present with us and with them, is really illuminating for me in my own spiritual path. Because in my own life, I sometimes can be quite selfish. Oh, such a surprise, right? And I think we each can have our own tendencies towards selfishness and control, domination, even if we don't think we're necessarily controlling or dominating, because often we'll look to kind of the worst symbols of those things, and we say, oh, well, I'm not that at all, or what they show on TV. But I find that often we can be centered in a type of selfishness, which is another word for those things, and starting to recognize that there's this kind of heavenly marriage between people and community, because if it says there's a heavenly marriage between God and heaven and the church and the goodness and the earth, then those things must be one too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also like this sentence, they are together as they emanate from the Lord, and they are together in heaven, so they need to be joined to each other in the church. And I think the reason this sentence stands out is because it's starting from the Lord. It's like these ideas aren't just starting from the church, or they're not starting from in us, but they start from the Lord. And to better understand them, we need to, better understand how they relate to divinity and how they help us grow and become better. Yeah,
that's so true. And it looks like there's some other comments from folks in the chat-see. I'm being told by Elbert that the afterlife is another word for heaven and hell. The next life is a synonym. Paradise, nirvana, the kingdom of heaven, the promised land, the heavenly kingdom, the city of God, the celestial city, the abode of God. I like this. This is a nice meditation. It's almost like a mantra with different phrases. The abode of the saints, the abode of the angels, Zion, Abraham's bosom, the Empyrean, the beyond, the hereafter, the next world, the next life, the afterworld. And it keeps going. That's beautiful. The New Jerusalem, name of this book, and others. Excellent. Oh, he says he Googled it. Well, Google is a nice source of information. Good place to start, usually.
Yeah. If you ever need a definition of a word.
Wait, it's called Google? Is that what it is? I heard that it was a good tool. No, actually, I think this is a good space. I know this is kind of a new venture for us, a new type of podcast for the Swedenborgian online community. But I think this is a good space where we can research things as we go along. Take some time, maybe be a little bit more informal, like, just doing funky things like that, just so I can get a smile and a smirk out of you, mainly, and just let loose a little bit. I heard our dog kind of stomping around, and usually we don't let her do that, so maybe we can work her in a little more. But yeah, anything else that catch your eye in the chat? See, there's a few other comments.
No, there's some great conversation though, so it's excited. I'm excited to see everyone, and welcome, Paige.
Yeah, greetings. And so we have this idea that everything relates to goodness and truth. And I think we find throughout Swedenborg that he tends to tie back to this idea. And in fact, he says the metaphors that kind of present themselves in reality tend to correlate back to this idea, this heavenly marriage, in all its forms, not just the terms goodness and truth, but love and wisdom and other analogs. And I think it's interesting because if you look at like even physics, you can see like this idea of goodness and truth. But maybe we need more background in what these terms mean. So shall we continue in our reading?
Sure.
Do you mind continuing for us? I can read too, but I like your voice.
All the intelligence and wisdom that angels have comes from that marriage. None comes from anything good separated from what is true, or from anything true separated from what is good. The same goes for the intelligence and wisdom of people in the church. Since the joining together of goodness and truth is like a marriage, we can see that anything good loves what is true, and that correspondingly, anything true loves what is good. Each longs to be joined to the other. People in the church do not have this love and this longing, are not participating in the heavenly marriage. This means that the church is not yet in them, because the joining together of goodness and truth is what makes the church.
Fascinating. I feel like we're treading into interesting waters here. But let's start at the top. So let's paraphrase this one. We have something about all smarts, all braininess, and deep insight that people in heaven have, because he believes angels are dead people in heaven. Actually living a life more living than ours typically is. And they get all of that braininess and that insight from this connection. And so I'm curious, does this connection, is he relating it probably to all of what we talked about before, but is it more about the the marriage between heaven and God, or goodness and truth, do you think?
I think they're one and the same. The marriage of goodness and truth, and the marriage of heaven and God, or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they're not analogous, right? Because it says heaven receives goodness and truth. So I think you're right. But I'm curious, like for myself, I want to figure out, is it I don't even know how to put that word into analogous.
Synonymous.
Is it synonymous, like word for word? Because we get love and wisdom from divinity, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Do you believe that?
Yeah, I mean, this is more specifically venturing into that marriage of goodness and truth, and why they're important together and not separate.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly talking about how they can't be separate, because if they are, then, then it's not real, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, he's saying if you don't have that marriage, and I don't know if that means you can have one or the other, but not yet the other, then you're not yet part of the church in his definition. So in a way, he's kind of defining church in a certain approach at the beginning of this book.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience with Swedenborg, when he's talking about the church, have you ever felt like he's like very tunnel vision with this idea, or how do you usually interpret Swedenborg when you think about people in general?
Well, he definitely is coming from his own background, growing up Protestant, right? And Lutheran, and like he has this idea of like what church folk are, but he always, ventures beyond that understanding and tries to be a little bit more inclusive in his understanding of what church is and what the heavenly community can be.
Yeah. In a community like this where we have people of many different ideas and views, like, and a community like heaven, as he describes it, because it has people from all different faith backgrounds, we like to emphasize that diversity. Mm-hmm. But you're right, like often he's writing from his own context, and he's also talking to a Christian audience.
Yes.
And of course he's Christian himself with a very high Christology, if that means anything to you. One personhood in the Godhead, not three. Mm-hmm. But he also thinks you don't have to believe in that historical Christ to get into heaven.
True.
So it's kind of fascinating how he kind of dabbles in aspects of inclusivity and also uses ideas or terms that seem very tunnel vision.
Yeah. He can be both specific and still have like an overarching theme that is a bit more inclusive and interfaith even.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we move on in this reading, I want to do another short connecting segment where we look at these tarot cards. Yes, we both enjoy tarot. It's by Alana Fairchild, but it's quotes from Rumi, and she and Rumi kind of have some insight into different ideas with these tarot cards, and we've had a lot of fun with them. So would you pull the card for us today?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I like this one.
Oh, excellent.
It's called Blessing of Zahara, and it's actually a really pretty card. For those listening, it's what's really cool about this deck is it's quite artistic. It's done in watercolors, and this one has a lovely woman looking up towards a little light, and it's in cool colors, so blues and greens and purple. I'm going to read a little bit of a section from the reading itself. So for every card they give a beautiful quote from Rumi. So I'm going to read the quote. Let go of thought. Do not take it into your heart. You are naked, and thought is like ice. You use thought to seek release from suffering and pain, while thought is the cause of your suffering and pain. The realm of creation is outside the scope of thought. O foolish one, see the opus and behold the beauty. Look in the direction from which the images flow. See the brook that causes the wheel to turn.
Wow. Wow. So how might we connect this? Let's think about that as we take just a short couple deep breaths, allowing the Sufi mystics' words to inform our life today. From the get-go, for me it connects to our topic, goodness and truth. Let go of thought, it says. Don't take it into your heart. You are naked, and thought is like ice. So it may seem a little at odds, but I actually think it connects nicely. What do you think?
Well, I actually think it's a great thing, because we're talking about this marriage of goodness and truth, and in this it's talking about how sometimes one element of the marriage, this being thought and heart, where one can be overbearing or being used too much. You might be overthinking, and that can actually cause disruption. So like it was saying, from the Swedenborg, people in the church who do not have this love and this longing are not participating in the heavenly marriage. So if, you're missing the heart, then, things are out of balance, and you're not going to get very far, to be honest. It makes life harder, and I think Rumi is pointing that out too, that when you overuse the head and don't always listen to the heart, transitions in life, things are harder, and they're missing that heavenly marriage.
Yeah, I think you're right on. This idea of using thought to release yourself from suffering and pain, whereas we shouldn't be doing that because it's the cause of it. In this Rumi quote, it says, I think that's really insightful, because often, especially when you're in front of a camera or talking about something as heady as spiritual reflection or theology, it's easy to get too caught up in your head and thoughts. And as you were saying, not allowing that or seeing it in yourself, and trying to mitigate it so that you stay heart-centered is really beautiful. And often Swedenborg talks a lot about kind of layers of our psyche or of our spirit. And he talks about, there's this core of love that God has within each of us, bringing us together in community, uplifting healthy things and goodness and wisdom. And there is a kind of a reciprocity between your goodness and your thought, But I think that core of love we shouldn't be applying thought to dampen it, because often that's what we're coming out of, right?
Yes.
And instead being more attuned to it is better. So, wonderful. I'm curious if there are any thoughts in the chat. Do you have any other thoughts about that, Alyssa, yourself? No?
No. Sorry.
No, you're good. You're reading the chat. I see a quote here. They're talking about some fun things about life. That's cool. And a quote from Arcana Celestia, which is Swedenborg's exploration of the meaning of Genesis.
Yeah. Also, Secrets of Heaven.
Yeah, also called Secrets of Heaven.
Yeah.
In the newer translations. The books of the Word are all those which have the internal sense, the quote says. Books which do not have it are not the Word. The books of the Word in the Old Testament are the 5 books of Moses, the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the 2 books of Samuel, the 2 books of Kings, the Psalms of David and the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And in the New Testament, they are the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Revelation. Yeah. So sometimes Swedenborg does define the Word, especially when he's talking about Scripture, as certain books of the Bible. But of course, the Bible itself says the Word gave forth to creation. And Swedenborg explores how the Word is actually all structure of the universe. In fact, he relates the Word to truth. So in a way, the title of this series is connected to our topic today.
Which is cool, because the quote from Arcana Celestia, it's saying that the Word is things that have internal sense. And if they don't seem to have internal sense, then they don't seem to be the Word. Which Swedenborg may not necessarily say falsity, as in some of these books of the Bible are falsity, but they're not necessarily the Word.
Yeah, well, exactly. He had this idea that the books of the Bible that he would call the Word have these metaphorical layers that talk about our hearts and how we can grow towards divinity in each other. And he would say, like, a letter from Paul, although beautiful, and often he actually quotes from Paul's letters from time to time, although beautiful, aren't the Word to him, because they have, or as far as he's concerned at all, because they don't have that kind of metaphorical narrative quality. But he would say that to the extent that divinity speaks to you, that's the Word speaking to you, whether it's in your experience or a letter from Paul.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting, because it's easy for me to get caught up in, like, his definitions, and yet sometimes they seem to bleed into each other in different ways.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Mark. That's great. Someone also shares, churches sometimes seem to forget the importance of the union of the good and true, that neither one alone is sufficient. Has that ever been true for you in your life, Alyssa?
Yeah, I've run across a couple of churches that seem to be lacking. I think often churches that stick really closely to how the Bible, reading the Bible is very literal, end up, except focusing more on the truth. And don't always think of goodness. It's, lacking in some love and some action, which we'll read in a little bit, but he equates goodness with action often.
Yeah, like love and act is goodness.
Yeah.
But so is love in the heart.
True.
Yeah. But in a way, like, what's in our heart is a type of action. More real sometimes than walking down the street.
Yes.
Yeah. That's a good point. I'm curious, what about for you, like, personally? Do you ever feel like sometimes you lean too much one way or not?
Oh, plenty of times.
Yeah.
The one reason I like the
Same
quote
here.
we read from Rumi is because I am a very heady person. I tend to get really stuck up in my head and forget to follow my heart a lot, or vice versa. So, finding a balance between the two when I'm feeling very stuck in my head, taking a moment to breathe and to relax and to meditate, and when I'm feeling really stuck in emotion, using my mind and using truth as a way to recenter and find divinity in all things.
What are those, like, those letters that everyone says? I forget mine, but like that talk about if you're head-centered or...
the Myers-Briggs.
The Myers-Briggs. Yeah, what are you on the Myers-Briggs?
Oh, I'm an INFJ.
Yeah.
Which is what Mother Teresa is, or would have been.
So tell us what kind of generally what that means.
INFJs tend to be people who are very compassionate and would, like, give you the shirt off their back.
So that's kind of heart-centered.
Yeah, very often heart-centered. Very often actions. Always looking to do good actions, looking to take care of people.
Yeah.
The J is judging, so we tend to use, like, thought processes, and we tend to make not necessarily judgments, but we tend to, like, use our head to help our heart do what it wants.
So, like, your affections tell your head how to, like, judge or enforce things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it means sometimes I jump to conclusions because of how I feel.
I think we all do that kind of thing where we kind of either are afraid of a certain outcome or want it, and we just create that truth around us because of our heart. Yeah. So in a way that relates directly to what Swedenborg was talking about, where, we have to have some real truth to connect with our goodness or our love. And we have to have some real love, like not for like selfish things or dominating things, for it to truly connect with the wisdom in our life. Because if we're kind of off kilter, then we're misusing one or the other potentially. Something else catch your eye?
No, just seeing what everyone's talking about. I'm normally on here reading it. So.
Yeah, it's usually easier to chat with folks in the chat too for you. Cool. Looks like people are connecting well. I'm curious, when it comes to Rumi, so we just read from the Sufi Muslim mystic, as I mentioned. How does he usually inform you when you read Rumi? I know you're a fan of his, so am I.
Yeah, so Mevlana Rumi, he is a mystic, very similar to Swedenborg, but whereas Swedenborg often did they both did a ton of writing, but Swedenborg comes from the scientific background. Rumi comes from this place of the arts. He wrote so many poems and did a great deal of advocating for the arts in religion because the Sufi religion really didn't, the Sufi part of Islam really hadn't done a ton of developing by his time, so there's actually entire sects devoted to his teachings and his understanding. The whirling dervish come to mind because they use a lot of the ideas and a lot of the poetry from Mevlana Rumi to inform how they connect to divinity. And so, that emphasis on the arts and dance, poetry, painting really inspires my own tradition and my own connection with divinity.
Oh, amazing. Thank you for sharing that. It reminds me of how a lot of people will relate to Swedenborg.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Swedenborg isn't considered to be God in any sense of the idea, except to the extent that each of us have divinity. It's more like he was a mystical theologian that inspired people to get together in certain ways, especially ways that seem to kind of emulate what he wrote about, because that's kind of natural, right?
Yeah.
That's why you gravitate to it. And I think Swedenborg, more than many other theologians, I mean, Luther comes to mind because, Christians who follow follow Luther or called Lutherans. But I think Swedenborgians, in particular, tend to have more of a focus on his theological writings, partly because of his spiritual visions and the fact that he believed that the Lord came to him and showed him the spiritual world, and other things like that. And I think that makes sense too, because there's not a lot of books about the afterlife. Even the Bible doesn't talk a whole lot.
Yeah, that's
about
true.
It. Yeah. Okay, so what do you want to do next? I know we have a few things on our agenda that we can turn to if we'd like.
The next 2 sections of what we're about to read is one I really enjoy, because we do kind of get into what does goodness mean and what does truth mean. So
okay, perfect.
Yeah. So 16. We already read.
It's up.
Okay. Goodness takes many forms. Basically, it can be spiritual or earthly. And these two types of goodness come together in what is genuinely good on the moral level. The same goes for the types of truth as for the types of goodness, because truth comes from what is good and are forms of what is good. Yeah.
So I'm just going to repeat what you said. Goodness takes many forms. It can be spiritual or earthly. And these two types of goodness come together. So it takes kind of this internal realm, this higher realm, to connect with the earthly realm, or even give forth to it. And to form what is genuinely good on the moral level.
Yeah.
So we're talking about morality here too. Which we touched on, but morality is something that sometimes kind of falls to the wayside when we talk about spirituality.
Yeah.
I don't find it much falling away in Swedenborgian circles, because a lot of it is about how you're treating people. Mm-hmm. But often I grew up in Protestant churches myself, and although sometimes you'd get the sermon about one of the 10 Commandments or something.
Love your neighbor.
Yeah. In a way, it always struck me to be kind of strange, because there was also all this emphasis on believing in the name of Jesus.
Yeah.
And if you didn't, you're going to hell. And so in a way, you should only really be moral if you're Christian. But if you're Christian, the morality will come, but you don't have to focus on it because you're already kind of getting into heaven. That was in fact, that was stated very clearly many times, but it depends on the Christian, of course. Mm-hmm. What do you take from that quote?
So we're starting to talk about what goodness and truth look like. Although Swedenborg kind of often still leaves it in this realm of just seeing. He describes it through seeing it in different forms. I like that this starts to introduce it as not only something internal, something about the spirit, but also something about the earthly. These two elements go together. You can't have the body without the soul, and you can't have the soul without the body. And so we're continuing this theme of marriage and being combined, and creating a whole idea of divinity in a way.
Yeah. Now I still feel, though, that we haven't quite defined these terms from Swedenborg's point of view. So can I read the next section?
Absolutely.
The relationship between what is evil and what is false is the inverse of the relationship between what is good and what is true. That is, just as everything in the universe that is in accord with the divine design goes back to what is good and what is true, so everything that violates that design goes back to what is evil and what is false. Further, just as what is good loves being joined to what is true, and what is true loves being joined to what is good, likewise, what is evil loves being joined to what is false, and what is false loves being joined to what is evil. And just as all intelligence and wisdom are born of a bond between what is good and what is true, so all madness and stupidity are born of a bond between what is evil and what is false. The bond between evil and falsity is called the hellish marriage. Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow. So there's such thing as evil and falsity, according to Swedenborg.
And they're really the opposites of what is good and true, which makes a lot of sense. So it's this idea of turning away from divinity that is what is hellish. Like
turning away from just the idea of divinity, or what?
Not necessarily the idea, although the idea helps, but like the essence of divinity, so goodness and truth.
So like the qualities of God that we hear about, like love and justice, which Jesus was really big on. Although sometimes we seem to have forgotten. And that, to me, that's where I see the most evil and falsity in this world, is like in the huge injustices and structural evils in the world, in our systems, how we treat people, how we can, treat those even just in our own life.
Yeah.
But it all seems to have this kind of form of injustice. So evil, falsity, those terms sometimes strike people as like really heavy.
Yeah, especially evil.
Yeah.
Because, even me, I don't like the word because, it's come with a lot of baggage, just from other traditions, like using it as a way to cause harm to other people and using it as a way to other themselves.
Other people who don't see things the same way as we do, or that are different or scare us.
Yeah, so that's why I always go, well, for me personally, I have to remind myself that this is a word being used to describe that lack of divinity. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and since, this is kind of the pride season of the year, often people in the LGBTQIA community are labeled as evil, at least they have been, which is quite unfortunate and destructive. And
very.
You're right, like there's some baggage. Although there's baggage with words like truth and church and God.
True. Absolutely.
But so how do we suss through this baggage? So when you think of evil now, because it's hard to get away from that term of Swedenborg, how do you kind of relate it to, and I think you already kind of touched on
well,
this.
I do this for lots of different words that I find that I have a visceral reaction to. I have to redefine them for myself. And sometimes I change the word entirely if I just can't. Like, I don't like using the word sin. You'll never hear me say it unless it's me saying I don't like the word. I will change that word to something else, something that comes maybe from the Hebrew. So sin is a word that we chose from a different from the Hebrew word, but the Hebrew word speaks more of like misstep. Like, you made a mistake. So I'll often say, instead of reading the Bible where it says sin, I might replace that with mistake or misstep or caused harm, because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the results of our actions when we're talking about sins.
Sure, yeah. I think you're right. And sometimes the results are internal results because we're thinking about things so destructively and dominatingly that we kind of create a hellishness inside, and to whatever extent that we're connected to evil in our lives, because I take the term seriously nowadays, but mainly just for my own kind of reflection on injustices within my spirit and around. I feel like we love that hell. We love those evils, and we often don't call them that. And so in my own walk, there's baggage with this term evil, but I think maybe less than yours. But often I found we would write off the idea of morality often in Christian circles beyond following Jesus. We might focus on it sometimes, but it tended to come back to, are you in or are you out? And within Swedenborgian Christian thought, I find I can focus more on if I'm being destructive, if I am following the Ten Commandments, if I'm following also kind of a spiritual sense of it, and really kind of get down to how how evil is my heart trying to be? Because often we don't want to see the darkness in the world or in ourselves.
Yeah.
And if we, were to get a little glimmer of how evil things can be and are often, it would blow our minds. And sometimes we know it, but we want to forget it, and we don't want to challenge it. And in fact, we're not enabled often because we're not connecting back to a higher power or goodness of love, and allowing that to help dispel our fears and embolden our action. Yeah. I wonder what people are saying in the Chatsy. Albert shares evil, falsity versus goodness, truth, demonstrates how logical ES can be in his doctrines. Yeah, I find it quite logical, but often people will focus on kind of a duality. This idea and how duality can be bad. Because I think it goes back to what you mentioned, which is we often use it to other ourselves or other people. My body's not good enough, or I'm bad because I love people of the same, gender, etc. But how do you reconcile, kind of in the big picture, othering versus trying to improve things that are destructive in our hearts and lives?
For me, that just seeing divinity in other people. Because there is a huge difference between othering and seeing differences. So, like, you're a guy and I'm a girl, but, that doesn't make me see you as the enemy because you're a guy. It's more about finding our common ground and then celebrating the differences. And if those differences are harmful, acknowledging them and lovingly help the other person, or, encourage goodness in other people. Some people aren't ready for change, and we have to be sort of accepting of that, not always. To the degree that it's, we have to accept it to the degree that not accepting it causes ourselves harm. And finding balance in life. So, the biggest difference for me when people when othering happens is the reality that people aren't seeing how they're the same, seeing the divinity in other people. Yeah. And so always re-emphasizing, the goodness in other people and trying to uplift that.
I love that. And sometimes if it's hard to see divinity in someone's actions or their heart, sometimes it helps just acknowledge that divinity is there. Because Swedenborg talks a lot about hell, and these, hell is made up of people who want to continue to make hell. Yeah. And they can't quite be, turned the other way because they love it. They think that's their life, and they want it to be their life. But God is still with them. It's just that they're trying to not be with God, and they're like actively turned away in their spirit, in a sense. And so, like, just acknowledging that God is present even in our own destructive things. I think you could say, like, if there's part of you that you think is hurtful towards other people, that's you could say is ill in a way because it's affecting the rest of you poorly. And sometimes you can find it in, he mentions morality in the section before, sometimes you could find it in morality around sexuality, morality around honesty, morality around self-harm and hurting others, controlling, et cetera, right? But instead of thinking of that as othering, or instead of othering it and saying, just, you're gone, because that usually doesn't work, for me, it's been helpful to say, yes, you're destructive. Get away from me. But to the extent it doesn't, allowing myself to accept that it's there and looking at where it's coming from, and then maybe finding other places that need healing in that process. And that's been helpful in my walk.
That's great, too. Because, the biggest challenge, why our society is often, like, pointed towards things as being evil, is because they cause harm, but we don't always see why those like people are causing the harm. Because one of my favorite phrases is hurt people hurt people. And so, like, at some point someone felt hurt, and as a result they maybe do harmful things. Although that's not always true. There is a big correlation between the pain you receive from people and the pain they're feeling.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let us turn to our closing segment, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I think ending with a little bit of the Bible sounds like a great way to do it.
Yeah. And, Mark mentioned Isaiah as one of the books of the Bible that Swedenborg believed were the Word, part of Scripture. So that's one answer. Thank you for providing it, Mark, for what is the Word.
Yeah.
Now, although Swedenborg also thought there may be other books in the world and elsewhere that he would consider the Word. Mm-hmm. Isaiah is one of them. So let us just choose something random. What do you think?
I will turn my... Okay, so this is Isaiah 1:25. I think I'm going to do 25 and 26. I will turn my hand against you, and will smelt smelt away your dross as the lye, and remove all your alloy. I will restore your judges as at the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterward you shall be called the city of righteousness, and the faithful city.
Wow, what a great quote to end on. And this is also emphasizing to me, like, that the Bible often does say, you are being destructive, change.
Yeah.
And we get quotes like this, too, that he says, I will smelt away your dross as with lye, and remove all your alloy. Like, I will remove all the evil,
the harm,
the falsity, and I will restore your judges. Mm-hmm. So that speaks to me of wisdom.
Yes.
As at the first, so connects the Garden of Eden in my head. Would you think so?
Yeah.
Or even kind of that quote we mentioned before in the beginning was the Word from John.
So the Word being the judge, the truth.
In the beginning. Yeah. So I'll restore your rationality as with holy truth and wisdom, the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so that also speaks to me of goodness, because when you think of, and this may have its own context, I know counselors do, but when we say counselors today, we often think of people uplifting health and goodness and wholeness in people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, ending with this idea of a finished city of righteousness and a faithful city. What I love about that is we've been talking a little bit about goodness and truth, and the opposite of that being evil and falsity. And we've been talking about how we reorient ourselves to goodness and truth. But this is a reminder that we don't have to do it alone. We don't have to always be pushing, always be taking on that burden, that God, divinity, will apply that goodness. Will help us wash away all the bad that keeps us from feeling goodness and love from that truth.
That's wonderfully put. Yeah. Thank you, Alyssa, for your thoughts today. And what a good reflection to end on.
Yeah, that we don't have to do it all by ourselves.
Yeah, that divinity will establish our city of righteousness.
Well, and that goes back from the very first section we read, that all this comes from divinity. Goodness and truth come from divinity, and divinity will help us bring us back to goodness and truth. Yeah.
And, even though it says God will establish these things, there's always this kind of talk about progress or lack thereof. Yeah. And so for me, it's always important to remember God is in the progress. Like, our ability to look at the destructive things in our life, the quote-unquote evil things, the falsities, and work to make them better, isn't us not believing God, but it's actually allowing Divinity to do her work, to do his work in our lives.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, folks, for joining us on What is the Word? And hope you join us in a few weeks as we continue through the Emanuel Swedenborg book, New Jerusalem, which you can download for free at swedenborgiancommunity.org/explore, as well as maybe touching into tarot again, I don't know, and the Bible.
Definitely. We'll keep exploring what the Word is, and I look forward to more adventures together in this subject.
Yeah. Well, go forth knowing you are quite loved. Bye.
Bye.